Test, test, test.
That's for you. And then if you want to use this, it's got like a pointer on it. If you click there, if you need that, and then it just advances and goes back. Steve was going to introduce you.
Yes.
Do you want the lights dimmed?
Maybe a little bit.
Okay, we're almost getting ready to get started here tonight. I want to thank everybody that came tonight and welcome. And we really appreciate your patronage and being part of our talks. You guys are going to be in for a treat. This gentleman's been here before, and I'll talk more about him in just a minute. But first of all, just to let you know, you might have seen a sign at the door, but we have new hours. If you notice, for whatever reason, Citrus County and Inverness, nobody seems to want to come out of outdoors Monday nights. So we decided to close on Mondays, and now we're going to be open Tuesdays through Saturdays. And Miss Lindsay and Andrea have set up family days here on Saturdays, on the first and third Saturday of every month. And they have quite a few events coming up. The next one is going to be a kids scavenger hunt on the 16th, and they'll have family board games on other Saturdays, kids corner and crafts on another Saturday, and so forth. So they got a lot going on for the family, and those of you that have grandkids or just want to get the neighbor kids out of the way, send them here. Send them here on Saturday morning. Also, we have a new art exhibit downstairs called the Art Oasis of Poems and Pieces. These guys are very, very good, very talented. And if you get the time to see it, if not, come on back and at your leisure and really absorb it. It is very interesting what people with talent can come up with. So it goes over my head because I have no idea, and I love what they do. It's great artistic value downstairs. On the third Wednesdays of the month, which would be April 20th, we have the Inverness Walks. It's a historic walk of at least 10 buildings here. It starts at 9 a.m., roughly an hour plus, and it's a lot of fun, and you get to ask the person the questions, and you get a lot of history of our local buildings and how we came to be where we are today. So that's the third Wednesdays of every month. All we're asking is that when you come, give us $5 just as a donation, so we can help out. And then the last, come on in. There's coffee, and if you want to grab it first to sit down, you're more than welcome. But come on in. The last concert of the the spring 2022 season is on Thursday, April 21st. It's with Craig Singleton and his band. He's going to be singing the hits of the decades. Those of you that forgot 60s, there'll be YouTubes to you. Those other ones in the 70s and 80s will be newer for you, so they'll work out very nicely. I spoke to him the other day. I did not know that he actually opened for James Brown a couple of times. I'm impressed. Plus, I tell you, he's old. He's at least 50. So I'm going on with that. So from that end, so that's happening there too. Again, we've got just tons of things going on all the time. Those of you that ever call in and check up, if you leave us your email, we can come back and send you updates on the events that come up. Now, the reason you're here, Mr. Sean Norman, Gulf Archaeology Research Institute. He's the research associate and the executive director. I like to call him our young Indiana Jones type for Florida. He does numerous studies. He does the modeling and relationships between climate change and landscape modification at Crystal River site. He does historical ecology and with the Miccosukee embayment and historic preservation plans. He's involved in the Tolaka archaeology project. I mean, this guy is just a great, great friend of our area and the Old Courthouse Heritage Museum, and he loves history and archaeology. I'm telling you, this is, if you want to go to somebody and model, your future self, ooh, there it is. That's the guy. That's the guy. And tonight, of course, he's going to talk to, and I had a hard time with it, Chucochatti conflict at the Red Town in 1836. I give you a shot.
I don't get the cheat behind me, or I don't get to cheat and look at my computer. All right, thank you guys for coming out. Thank you very much for the Old Courthouse Heritage Museum for having me, Citrus County Historical Society. Thanks for everyone in person and anyone watching this online. So tonight I'm basically going to talk to you about a history and archaeological project that my colleagues and I at the Gulf Archaeology Research Institute worked on from about 2019 to 2021. And essentially it was a project that we did in collaboration with and on behalf of the Historic Hernando Preservation Society. We did this using a National Park Service grant, American Battlefield Protection Program grant, where we basically kind of kept the subject matter vague and wide open. And the idea was to document any historical or archaeological evidence associated with the Seminole village or villages of Chucochatti, and any evidence related to the military actions that involved the burning of the town, specifically the 1836 campaign. First we'll start off with, as Steve pointed out, Chucochatti. It's I get asked a lot, basically what it means, how do you spell it, how do you say it? A lot of people apologize for spelling it incorrectly. First of all, there's really no way to spell it properly, and it gets spelled dozens and dozens of different ways. Some of the more fun ones are up there. Chucochatti is a Muskogee word or Muskogee generally means something like red town or red house. In this regard, it's not referring to the color of anything. It's basically a creek designation that they had, where there was some towns were designated as white towns, other towns were designated as red towns, and this was sort of a political alignment that they had, where white towns were principally responsible for things like domestic and internal policy. Red towns were typically associated with war. This is something that kind of fades over time. It's very difficult to study archaeologically, and to what degree this is still kind of instituted and utilized by the Seminole at all, much less by the Second Seminole War, a little bit up for debate. And we'll get into that, how there's a little bit of nuance to being a red town. So, as I said, it's spelled a ton of different ways, and that's the red town is in Muskogee language. Muskogee being one of the many Creek languages, but is generally considered the principal or primary language. It's sometimes referred to as Creek itself. Whereas amongst the Seminole, nowadays the Seminole tribe of Florida are predominantly Miccosukee or Miccosukee speakers. Also Creek languages, very common Creek languages. But Muskogee ended up being more of a secondary language amongst the Seminole tribe. I think Muskogee's only commonly spoken on one reservation at the moment. But that's one of the kind of key things that makes Chucochatti unique. It was also founded in 1767, so it's a particularly old Seminole village. Seminoles kind of start coming to Florida, start becoming Seminoles maybe as early as the 1720s, but generally there's a pattern that we'll kind of go over later on how Florida kind of gets populated during this time. So principally, most of the early villages tend to be towards northern Florida, and they're, again, mostly Miccosukee speakers. Now, we'll say that the town that we're mostly going to talk about gets burned in 1836 during the first year of the Second Seminole War, but we'll say that the area is kind of abandoned around 1842, the conclusion of the war. Basically, the way the war operates are troops will move into an area, they'll clear an area, and then as soon as they move out, the Seminole are more than capable of reoccupying the area, sort of a Vietnam type situation. So even though we know that a lot of the people abandoned the Chucochatti area at the very outset of the war, the town was burned, there's still at least some roving bands of Seminole that occupy the area basically until the end of the war. The thing that ultimately kind of removes the Seminole from the area is the Armed Occupation Act of 1842, in which case you get this rush of settlers moving into Central Florida. And then finally, when I refer to Chucochatti, or when anyone refers to Chucochatti, it can be a village, it can refer to multiple villages, because there were various iterations, depending on how you want to classify a village. Chucochatti can also be a region. Basically, it's sort of central Hernando County, a little bit into southern Citrus County. So places like the Chucochatti Hammock and the Anatoliga Hammock. Villages in all of those sections are often called Chucochatti or associated with Chucochatti. And then finally, Chucochatti can be considered a people. So I was just talking with a friend of mine. Basically, they're considered Eufalas when they come down here. But over time, and especially if you don't know that they're from Eufaula, they get referred to as the Chucochattis. This is also sometimes another shorthand way of saying Muskogee speakers. But again, that changes over time. So one of the things that we did is my colleague Jonathan Dean, essentially, there's only a limited amount of material that was ever really written about Chucochatti of any substance. There are a lot of brief mentions, a sentence here or there, but only a few real descriptions going back into the 1700s. But one of the things that hadn't really been addressed is there are different maps and how Chucochatti gets represented. So my colleague Jonathan Dean basically did a cartographic study of Chucochatti, where he went back with every map he could find going to the 1600s. We knew that some of the written descriptions describe the people of Chucochatti as Eufalas. So, okay, let's see where we can find all the Eufalas that we had. And their origins go back into central Alabama. So the Creek people are basically the direct descendants of Mississippian mound builders. Places like Moundville in central Alabama around Tuscaloosa. You've got places like Ocmulgee in central Georgia. So the big flat top mound builders. So this is, Florida didn't even really have much of a Mississippian period. But you've got big pronounced mound complexes along these massive rivers in the greater Southeast. And so these people are the direct descendants of that. And along the Alabama River, the Tallapoosa River, and the Coosa River, you get a series of large villages. And we go back, and they are some known as Eufaula, and then there's another one called Greater Eufaula. And then additionally, you've got another town that's referred to as Atassi. And Atassi is such a major town, at least archaeologically thinking, and you have to remember that the way archaeologists describe periods without written language, we basically a lot of times call things based on what we call the pottery or something like that. So the Atassi end up being one of the cultural periods essentially in between the Creek people being known as the Creek and when they were the mound builders. And so there's some sort of relationship between all these towns. So they're based out of, like I said, central Alabama, and then you've got essentially what become the Lower Creek range all the way from the Savannah River on the coast, and then principally settle in this kind of orange oval area. Oh, I do have a laser pointer. There we go. In the lower Chattahoochee Valley. And so we know that there are towns of Eufaula that go back into at least the late 1600s. Greater Eufaula definitely appears on maps by that point. And then you've got a lot of settling in this area. But in 1689, the Spanish set up a very small garrison, about right here, sort of in the middle of the lower Chattahoochee Valley. And I mean a small garrison, like 20 people. And they set up, and that basically disrupts and causes a full abandonment of the lower Chattahoochee Valley for a while. And the idea was that there's sort of this interaction going on between the English and the Creek. They're doing a lot of trading, principally for deer skins. And so the Spanish set this up there to kind of put a gap in that, and it causes everyone just to leave the territory. The problem is it only partially causes a divide. So the Creeks here are still trading with the English, but don't have a direct relationship as much. Whereas these people just move right back here, and some of them go right here, where they now are just across the Savannah River from the English who have trading posts and can immediately take the goods back to Charlestown. And so it basically means that these people from South Georgia that were later called the Lower Creek end up having a direct relationship with the English. So the Spanish, oddly enough, garrison this fort, and within 2 years they've abandoned this little, it's called Fort Apalachicola, not to get mixed up with the river, the modern day town or anything like that. And they abandoned this place. But the lower Chattahoochee doesn't really get reoccupied immediately. Instead, it's a series of wars that happen in the Carolinas in the 1700s, 17 teens, that results in basically a dramatic population push down here, which makes a lot of these people come back over here and resettle. So by this point, and this is by about 1718, so by this point, the Lower Creek, who have been over here, and the Upper Creek have kind of turned into two different cultures, sort of the English associated ones and then the more native or more self-dependent creeks. And this will later feed into what becomes the various Creek Wars. But in 1720, we see that a lower Eufaula pops up right around here. And in the log, they list Atassi Miko as basically being the head. And so that's how we're able to trace, and Miko is just a term for a leader, a sort of a chief. And so basically that suggests that Lower Eufaula is essentially like a satellite town or a colony that comes off of Greater Eufaula and Atassi, meaning Atassi might be the same town as Greater Eufaula or Eufaula. It gets more confusing. But by this point, that means that you're already seeing like a blending of people, because you're now getting Upper Creeks mixing with some of these more anglicized Lower Creeks. So I'm not going to go through all of the different maps. There were something like 40 maps that my colleague went through. That'll end up probably being a separate presentation I'll give for Historic Hernando Preservation Society at one point, but just to kind of show you some of the variations. So you've got Upper Eufaula marked right here, Lower Eufaula marked here, and this is in the mid-1700s. And then by the late 1700s, we're starting to get some representation of Eufaula in Florida. Now, Romans is one of the earlier descriptions of Chucochatti or Eufaula, but the problem is whether or not he's describing the same town that we're describing kind of remains up for debate, because he gives like some measurements, like some distance between two towns, but the problem is the measurements don't really make a lot of sense. You can try them for a few different locations, and if you put Chucochatti where Chucochatti, or Eufaula where Chucochatti's at now, it means that Talofa or Chazy is in a weird place, and vice versa. And he also plots it really far east, so east of the Lake Wales Ridge instead of being, around the Brooksville Ridge. And so this ends up being closer, south of Lake George. And So we're not sure if he's representing a sister town or related town, or if this is supposed to be what eventually becomes Chucochatti. And then the problem is, on the way maps work at this time, is people don't really go out and analyze the maps. They just copy older maps, and they might make minor changes. So you might have the same map gets produced for 30 or 40 years over and over again, and the only thing that might change is whatever's of specific interest to the author. So this kind of persists through time. Here's a later one, 1793, where New Eufaula, as it's listed here, is still roughly in the same place, still in the vicinity of Lake George. But the main thing on this one is, if you notice, they really only mark 2 towns, Tuscarora and New Eufaula, suggesting sort of the importance of this. And again, also shows that peninsular Florida, well, there were certainly more towns than are shown on this map, but it shows you that central Florida, peninsular Florida, wasn't really that occupied until some of the later events. And we'll talk about those later events right now. So, as I said, you kind of see Seminole movements in waves. And exactly when the creek becomes Seminole, again, debatable issue. So what happens is you first see a large movement of Seminole during the Creek War. So Creek War of 1813, 1814 is basically a subset of the War of 1812. If you want to be fun about it, it's part of the Napoleonic Wars. But basically this creates a lot of turmoil, especially in south central Alabama. And so you get a lot of people move into Florida. Part of this is just generally to avoid the violence, and then part of this is some of the people know that this is Spanish Florida, and theoretically this is untouchable. Jackson proves that that's not the case, but basically the idea is if they move into a different countries or a different kingdom's territory, that they should be able to escape the war, especially those who didn't really want to participate in it. So that's kind of the first large movement that you get with the Creeks. And that's not to say that the Creeks had never gone into Florida. And Florida was mostly depopulated of its native populations essentially by the Spanish, mostly incidental, but disease and essentially the groups that were down here like the Tamuguans, the Tocobaguans, the Calusa, slowly declined in populations. And so what happened is the Creeks would have used this area as sort of a hunting ground. And so that the whole relationship with the Creeks is basically acquisition of firearms, hunting for deer skins, trading that off, getting prestige goods, building wealth, and the entire economy is built off this. And so it means that they have to start going farther and farther abroad to basically keep up with the rate of deerskin trade. And so Florida would have been that. And you would have had Creeks going all the way essentially down to the Keys. So they definitely would have been familiar with Florida, but they weren't setting up permanent residences. And part of the reason for those satellite towns that we see in Alabama might have been so that they would have had towns closer to these additional hunting grounds. But we start seeing the larger movements in the 1800s. So first this, and then during the first Seminole War, so 1817, 1818, you get Andrew Jackson invades Florida. And basically, he runs around, he comes down this way, and burns almost every Seminole village to about right here, to about the Swanee River, Old Town on the Swanee River. After that, he turns around and just harasses the Spanish for a couple months. But basically, he just burns large swaths, and so what happens is you get another migration towards basically the Alachua Prairie. There were already Seminole towns there, but basically the population doubles, quadruples in the vicinity, and you start getting more and more movement. And notice where Chucochatti's at. So the thing is, Chucochatti was settled really early, you're talking 50 years earlier than this, that they came all the way down here. So they were fairly isolated for quite a while. And then the next big movement that we have in the Seminoles is when the reservation's created. So, this 1823, it's set up. Notice that they're not really given any coastal access. The idea was basically to limit trade, outside influence, so they wouldn't have connections with the Spanish or the British or anything like that. So basically the American government could slowly control what their goods were and sort of economically strangle them. But you see basically a mass movement down here. Now, there are certain exceptions. Some towns had been rebuilt in the Panhandle, and certain groups were allowed to still live there. But for the most part, everyone moves down here, and you see this massive abandonment of the Alachua Prairie, which turns out happens to be pretty good farmland, so there's a reason why they kicked them out of there. So notice this little jut here on the west edge. So when they draw the reservation line, they basically make it to where they have to include Chucochatti into it. So there's, by this point, at least some understanding by U.S. government officials on the role and importance of Chucochatti, and essentially its long-established history there. So Chucochatti starts getting a little bit more documented, more described, now that you've got the American occupation of Florida, or ownership of Florida. So we start kind of getting a decline in Chucochatti's role and essentially its economic wealth over time. So in 1821, you've got the Coweta Raid. These were Creeks who were essentially aligned with the U.S. government. They were essentially raided a series of Seminole villages along the west coast of Florida, essentially looking for fugitive slaves. Amongst one of the towns was Chucochatti that was attached, because it did have a fairly large black Seminole population at the time. And that is kind of what's thought to kind of kick off its decline, or at least what's highlighted as its decline. But some of the descriptions, I believe this is a Dexter's description here, where he describes Chucochatti is having 320 acres of agricultural fields, over around 20 residences. Of course, how they're measuring residences, I'm not sure, and if it's just a small confined area, if it's the greater landscape. But it has 90 horses, 160 cattle, and it has a corn surplus in a time where most of the towns that they're looking at don't really have, they're not seeing any sort of surplus. And they kind of attribute this that Chucochatti is one of the few towns that can actually feed itself. Meanwhile, you basically have other contemporaneous or slightly later descriptions that describe Chucochatti as sort of a depleted wasteland, that essentially it's farmed out the landscape, it's no longer any good for large-scale agricultural production. But this is sort of a common thing that you see. The closer and closer they get towards trying to remove the Seminole, they start describing the land as worse and worse. Consequently, after the Second Seminole War, suddenly the land is described as the best land you've ever seen. You see the same thing repeatedly. Wahoo Swamp, one of the previous presentations I gave, was described the same way. It was either a horrible, dismal or wasteland, or it's the most beautiful place they had ever seen in your life. I've seen the Wahoo Swamp. It's all right. But so the thing is, it's everything's about land speculation. A lot of early American history is basically land speculation. I'll give you a presentation on the American Revolution sometimes. It'll be fun. So in 1832, you get the Treaty of Payne's Landing, and that's basically the treaty for the removal. A lot of discrepancies. We can argue about the legitimacy of the treaty. Nonetheless, it kind of happened. And so most of the Seminole don't really go along with it. But one guy, wrong one. There we go. Black Dirt. Fukalesti Hajo. By this point, he's now the chief of Chucochatti. He is one of the first ones who agrees, and he's known by Black Dirt, sometimes Black Craggy Clay. I have no idea why they use that description, but I like it. And so he's one of the ones who actually agrees to removal. So this is why I say that, when you get to that red town thing, just because you're a red town definitely doesn't mean you're warlike, because, and he had fought previously in some of the previous engagements, but at this point decided that he really didn't want to risk his family. Unfortunately for him, his family would drown on the way to Arkansas Territory. So he basically got the worst of all worlds. And he took a large portion of the Chucochatti population with him, but not all of them. So that basically leads us into the Second Seminole War. So Black Dirt would have capitulated at the very outset of the war. So by the time the campaign's going on, this is about the same time that he's moving to Arkansas Territory, or I guess now at this point they're starting to call it Oklahoma Territory. So by March 1836, we're a couple months into the Second Seminole War. The engagements around the Cove of the Withlacoochee have not been going well for the United States. They've pretty much lost every engagement that they've been in at this point. And it's now Winfield Scott's turn to try to administer the war and try to bring a quick end to it. So Winfield Scott's the department commander of the Eastern United States, or the Eastern Department. And he basically kind of sets this plan starting up in February. And what he wants to do is, all the previous battles have either been a matter of simple over-empowerment or lack of supplies. Battle of Camp Izzard, they basically almost starved to death. The Seminoles basically just let them live. At First Battle of the Withlacoochee, the very second engagement of the war, or formal engagement of the war, is basically they're just kind of overwhelmed. Their force gets split. They kind of get overwhelmed. They manage to defend themselves, but they take too many casualties and have to leave. So basically, Scott understands that you probably want to have a substantial force that you know that can sustain itself against the bulk of the Seminole military, which is maybe upwards of 2,000 warriors. But the idea is basically you send overwhelming power, and then you send it from multiple directions. That way you can sort of encapsulate them. The big issue is that the Seminoles are always able to basically navigate the terrain. Water's not really an obstacle for them. So you really can't box them in with a single force. Because if you fight them to a withdrawal, they'll just keep withdrawing until they get to a body of water, and then they'll move across the body of water, and the U.S. military has to then stop and figure out a way to get around. So the idea is if they enclose them in the Cove of the Withlacoochee, they'll be able to stop them. So he's going to get this little three-pronged plan. So Scott and Duncan Clinch are going to come down from Fort Drane in Marion County. Meanwhile, General Abraham Eustis is going to come from Volusia, actually from the East Coast, and going to come across, and he'll burn the Black Seminole town of Pleklakaha along the way. And then Colonel William Lindsay, a colonel in the U.S. Artillery, is going to come up from Fort Brooke with a large unit of Alabama volunteers, some U.S. regulars, some Louisiana volunteers, and some Florida volunteers, and is going to approach the Cove of the Withlacoochee from the south, and he's going to be at the Chucochatti region. So this is all going on in February. They're planning it. They're moving around weapons. They're moving around units. They're mobilizing units. And so by mid-March, Lindsay is basically ready to go. By March 13th, he's got his supplies. He's got all his men on board. But he has one problem. He doesn't really have enough wagons to to carry all the supplies with him to the Chucochatti region. So what he wants to do is he wants to set up a little depot, actually right here, at what it'll be known as Fort Alabama. Basically, he wants to build a little supply depot along the way where he can at least store some of the supplies. So he sets out, and basically it takes him several days just to get to where he wants to build this, which is the Hillsborough River, where the Fort King Road crosses the Hillsborough River. And he sets out, and basically all the bridges have been burned along the way, so he has to stop, rebuild the bridges, and finally makes it to where he wants to build this fort, builds it in about a day, and then turns around, heads back to Fort Brooke. So he makes it back to Fort Brooke on March 21st. When he gets there that night, he's got orders waiting for him from Winfield Scott, and he needs to be at the Chucochatti, or in the vicinity of Chucochatti by March 25th. So according to his orders, he's already late, basically. He now has 3 days to get back all the way up there. And it took him basically 3 days just to get to where he built Fort Alabama already. So what happens is he marches up and he relieves the garrison. He had left the Florida volunteers at Fort Alabama first. He replaces them with the Louisiana volunteers, and then starts up, and then just somewhere around south of Dade City, he forks off the Fort King Road onto the Chucochatti Road. And they start marching up, and the Chucochatti Road has a series of Seminole villages along the way. Basically, the Seminole always know where the U.S. military's at. They basically are following them the entire way. So the villages, whenever they encounter them, are already empty. For the most part, Lindsay's force burns each village that they come to. If it happens to be nighttime and it's about time for them to set up camp, they'll build a camp, they'll tear down the village, use that for fortification set up. Now, the Seminoles that are following them don't have a substantial force with them. And the Seminoles are probably tracking all three of these armies simultaneously. And again, they have enough men to fight one army, not all three. So they keep coming, so that what they do is they basically just harass Lindsay's force the entire time. They're constantly firing at them, even if it's just from a distance and out of range. They're screaming at them at various points. At one of the towns where they burn and then fortify an encampment, basically every time soldiers go to collect water from the spring, the Seminoles start shooting at them and screaming at them all night. And so the only thing that the soldiers can do is fire off their cannon to basically in the direction to, get a little bit of peace for a couple hours. So they keep marching up and down the road, and the main tactic that the Seminoles start using during the day is they attack the rear guard. So they'll sort of attack the supply wagons and the troops kind of hanging out around there. Or every time they get into a clearing and they start moving, they'll attack the last of the units. Get a casualty here, casualty there, but the U.S. military really can't reply. There's nothing that they can really do to stop this. And as they slowly get closer and closer to Chucochatti, the numbers appear to be swelling against them. But again, a lot of the fire's out of range, not really any real danger, just enough to make them stressed. So they get to about 2 miles from Chucochatti on the other side of a hammock, and they're notified by their scouts that they're now in the vicinity. So they stop by an area and they set up an encampment. And this is what we call Camp Broadnax. And so this is named after Robert Broadnax, who was the Inspector General for the Army of the Center, as Lindsay's was called, because clearly coming from Tampa means you're in the center. But, the left, that's somehow the left and that's the right. Anyways, I don't know why I wasn't north, east, and south, but Scott wanted to make it complicated. But anyways, so they set up this encampment. And all this encampment is it's basically a glorified horse pen. It's a small stockade, a couple logs high, basically, and it mostly was just there to hold in the horses. So they go ahead, and the idea was just to kind of sit there, and then when you're in the region, you're just supposed to fire off your cannon to let the other armies know that they're in the vicinity. Now, he arrives there on March 27th, so he's 2 days late, right? Winfield Scott hasn't even left Fort Drane yet. So the guy who gave the orders is not even following his own orders. And then Eustis is just roaming around the countryside out here. And so they set up Camp Broadnax, and then they basically sit there for 2 days. Now, on the night of the second, on March 28th, their second night there, at some point in the evening, they're basically they get a Seminole raid. And all it is the Seminoles are basically going after the horse pen. The idea is just to create as much chaos. They're either going to try to capture, release, or kill the horses. Again, they barely have enough wagons. If they lose their horses, then they definitely don't have enough to pull what supplies they have left. And again, keep in mind, they left on March 22nd, so we're now down to, they've used 6 days of rations. So they're already starting to kind of run low on food. They only had about 10 days at max. But of course, they got that supply depot, right? That's handy. So they get this small engagement. Basically, the U.S. volunteers are kind of surprised at first, but they're able to form up a few lines, return fire, and the Seminoles just kind of dissipate into the wood line. Overall, no casualties. So just a minor engagement, but again, enough just to keep the stress on. Nobody gets any sleep. So the following day, they set out from Chucochatti, and they still have never heard any replies from any of the cannons, because, again, none of the other armies are even in the vicinity. And so they head out, and they actually march into Chucochatti. Village is completely empty. But they don't burn it for some reason. They burned every other village that they've encountered, or at least dismantled it. But they don't burn Chucochatti. Instead, they march right on through, and they set up their next encampment. And this is they set up Camp Chisholm, which is near Lake Lindsay, just north of Brooksville. And so At Camp Chisholm, they basically set up another little tiny short stockade, and they sit there for a few more days. By this point, they are actually out of food. But they just kind of send out scouting parties hoping to find more food and seeing if they can locate any Seminoles. Again, they don't find any in large numbers, but they do manage to actually kill one Seminole leader who happens to be roaming around with a few other men. But nothing, no major engagement. And then they also find some roaming cattle, presumably the cattle of Chucochatti. And they're able to basically butcher the cattle, and that gives them another 2 days' worth of food. But by April 1st, they have heard no sign of either of the other armies, and they're, they're running out of food. So they decide, okay, we've got to go back. So they march all the way back down the Towachutka Road. They get to Fort Alabama. They don't resupply or anything like that. Instead, they head right on back to Fort Brooke. So whatever the point of that the supply depot was, I'm not sure. And instead, it just, for the poor Louisianans who have been garrisoned at Fort Alabama this entire time, they've basically been harassed day and night ever since they were deposited there. And the only peace that they described that they get was that brief little time when Lindsay stops by the fort for a second and then marches on through. That's the only time the Seminole kind of dissipate from the area. As soon as the army moves on, the Seminoles start attacking the fort again. So these guys are kind of left out there almost for no reason. I guess maybe Lindsay had intended to resupply and head back out, but what happens is on April 3rd, Scott and Clinch start moving through the area. They encounter the unburned village of Chucochatti, so they burn it down. So even the guy who went up there never actually burned the village. And then they take the direct route down to Fort Brooke. And then a few days later, Eustis kind of comes trickling in. Again, nobody encounters any other armies. He starts moving south, and then eventually a scout notifies him that the other armies are back at Fort Brooke, so he moves his army down there. So basically that ends the Chucochatti campaign, or the Chucochatti portion of Scott's campaign. Very anticlimactic. There was no large engagements, no capturing of Seminoles. They didn't pen them in, and the strategy completely failed. So what happens is basically for the rest of the month, there are various actions that kind of take place in the area. There's a garrison at Fort Cooper, there's the garrison at Fort Alabama, so they have to send people to go relieve essentially the sick and the wounded in those garrisons out of there. And then a lot of the enlistments for a lot of these volunteer units are expiring. So basically they kind of clear the area, they carve a few more military trails, and then they just abandon the campaign. If you saw the Wahoo Swamp Talk, that was the next campaign later that fall. Basically, the war kind of gets on hold for the next few months. So that's basically that campaign. Now, what happens is as the war goes on, specifically starting in spring of 1837, when Thomas Jessup takes over command, they start building a series of forts, and as the war goes on, different generals, different commanders start building more and more kind of forts in various areas. They've got different plans how they divide up the landscape. So over time, you'll end up with Forts Cross, Anatoliga, and DeSoto. Fort Cross being probably the most prolonged one in the Brooksville area. DeSoto is very, very short-lived. In Anatoliga, there's not a whole lot of information about. But what happens is basically this area, this kind of removes the shroud of war. So as I mentioned, the U.S. soldiers could be in an area, and then as soon as they would leave, the Seminoles would kind of move back in. So there are still villages that persist in the deeper parts of the Cove of the Withlacoochee throughout the war. But what happens is the more and more that troops start patrolling through the area, the more and more forts that they build, they're kind of removing a lot of these gaps, a lot of these blind spots to the U.S. military. And then the area gets mapped. Henry Prince makes a lot of much more detailed maps of the vicinity, and the area is no longer the great mystery that it was in 1836. And so, this slowly starts pushing some of the Seminole out of the area. And then additionally, there are later sort of scouring campaigns that periodically go out throughout the area. And there end up being a few more skirmishes. Colonel Davenport writes about his movement through the area. Bennett Riley writes a little bit about his. Riley describes an 1840 skirmish and makes it sound like a really big deal. In fact, in one of his reports, I believe he describes it as a Seminole stronghold. It's definitely not a Seminole stronghold at this point, but there are certainly Seminoles moving around. By this point, you have a Seminole leader named Tiger Tail, who's with the Tallahassee Band, who has basically moved in, and he's occupying most of Citrus and Hernando County, and he basically just stays at one place for one night or two. And some of the encampments that he's at sometimes get referred to as Chucochatti, or Eufaula Tustenagee's town, and you get different indications which are related to Chucochatti, even though Tiger Tail's not a Muskogee, he's not a Eufaula, entirely different group, but maybe some of the Chucochattis had joined up with him. And then you get a few other minor skirmishes where, they're smaller endeavors, where generally generals or officers kind of write them up to make them sound a little bit bigger than they are, because that's sort of how you get promoted at this time. All right, so we'll go into the archaeology a bit. So basically, all of this is what kind of leads us into how we think about conducting the archaeology. How we sort of plot out where we want to go, who we want to talk to, and what should be the priorities for our project. And we do this by kind of going through a lot of the primary source documents, the maps, a lot of the written descriptions. We talk to a lot of local historians, people who have done previous work in this area. We look at previous sites that have been excavated in the area, and we sort of came up with our game plan for this. So one of the places that we started out with was a site that was probably has the largest known Seminole component in Hernando County. It's a site called Homestead. Now, oddly enough, this one doesn't even really go into our cognitive model, because this is located in kind of hilly terrain on the southwest side of Brooksville, well west of the Chucochatti Prairie, and it's sort of an odd place for a Seminole village. Seminole villages tend to be in kind of wide open, expansive area because they're mostly ranchers by this point. To some degree, there's agriculturalists, and there's some argument whether or not they liked agriculture, the different role that different people played in agriculture. But the main thing is, you look at the Alachua Prairie kind of landscapes, they're these broad open areas, often kind of associated with older prehistoric sites, sometimes mound sites and various mound complexes. And so this is in kind of a weird area. It's also very far away from water. You have one little small steep spring coming out of the side of the hill, but overall not a lot. So it almost didn't even register on our cognitive map, except for it was known to have Seminole artifacts there. The problem is this site was excavated by two students from the University of South Florida in the early 2000s, but it really wasn't the subject of either of their theses, and it didn't really get formally written up or anything like that. There's no journal articles or technical reports or anything. So all the information we had was basically from their professor, Brent Wiseman, who does a lot of Seminole archaeology, and then sort of anecdotal evidence from people who had been involved in the excavation. A lot of people, still around who were involved in our project. So the kind of assertions that we had heard were that it's a sort of a mixed up site, in which case you've got prehistoric materials, so a lot of stone flakes, and then you've got a Seminole component, and then you've got this like mid-1800s to late 1800s component. That's the Hope aspect of it. The Hope family had lived here, amongst a lot of other places around the Chucochatti Hammock. And all these materials were essentially mixed up into one. Now, when the excavation was held out, their landowner was about to build a house on the property, held off, allowed them to do their excavations beforehand. And basically what the forms kind of suggested was that all this was mixed and that the soil was all mixed together. So there weren't nice layers of, okay, there's the prehistoric layer, break, Seminole layer, break, historic layer, or white settler layer. And so, the interpretations we had heard were essentially that this is probably a Seminole village, or what was the remnants from after the town was burned. And that this is maybe like a refuge town that some of the survivors had essentially set up and kind of survived out the later years of the war. The main evidence for this was this 1839 half dime that has 2 perforations in it. Now, to be fair, on coins, basically, as long as coins have existed, people have been messing with them. People have been making trinkets and their own little novelty jewelry for a long, long, long time, well into the Roman period, well before that. But things like these perforations, this is something that you would see Seminoles do. So it has a date, so it's clearly post the burning of the town. My only concern on this is that's an awful lot of wear on this coin, and I kind of wonder how much time would it take for a newly minted coin to get into Seminole hands? So if this thing's minted in 1839, how long would it take to, reach presumably a soldier or trader, make it down here, leave their possession, get into Seminole possession, maybe a soldier gets killed, they pick this up, and then how would it sustain that much wear? From other excavations, like at Fort King, we can get almost pristine coins that have been in the ground for 200 years. As long as you don't have a lawnmower running over it, a buried coin can actually remain in pretty good shape. So that's my only concern about this, because again, this is something that you might see people do in the late 1800s. Now, I don't know, a half dime might have been quite a lot for them. But they found tons of artifacts during this excavation. It was 5,000 artifacts, if I recall. And we were able to resecure the artifacts, kind of reanalyze them. And then we did our own soil coring of the property and then our own shovel testing to kind of, verify the interpretation. And basically we found the same thing. So you've got a whole variety of stuff, and the problem is there's a lot of stuff that overlaps. Now, when you think of what a Seminole site might look like, a Seminole site's going to look very similar to a historic settler site. You're still going to have like whiteware and pearlware ceramics. You're going to have bottle glass, particularly dark green bottle glass, aqua bottle glass. You might have nails, and you're still going to get cast iron. You're going to have brass kettles, pots and pans, cups, utensils. The only thing that really separates them is that you might have some slight changes in things like diet, but even that's going to look very similar. For example, the Seminoles don't really have a lot of pigs. They tend to eat cattle. Black Seminoles tend to eat more pigs. So you're going to see very little variations like that, but you'll see things like glass beads. Particularly, they like blue glass beads. And then, you might see things like lead musket balls, but again, those can be on settler sites. And then a lot of it comes into essentially reuse of items. So if you see a normal settler's item that's kind of used in an odd way or maybe modified later on, then that might be an indication of a Seminole site. But like I said, the problem is basically all this came out within the same foot or two of soil. And we basically went down there, confirmed, yeah, it's mixed up soil, a lot of mixed up artifacts. So you basically just and patterning is very, very hard to determine, in this case at least. But what we determined is that, there's some domestic goods, and then you get things like Chattahoochee brush pottery. That's probably your main indicator of a Seminole site. So they'll use their own native pottery and they'll use European pottery simultaneously. Do I have brushed pottery? Oh, yes. Brushed pottery being up here. And by brushed, all it is it's literally just basic like grass vegetation scraped along the surface. So, they have much fancier designs in the 1300s, 1500s. And for whatever reason, by this point, pottery design was literally, the second most basic you can have. You can just make it plain. The thing was, we found this, but it's in a relatively limited geographic area. Again, not a lot of water. So the determination is, it might be a post-1836 iteration of the town, but it probably would have been reduced to maybe 3 nuclear families. It doesn't appear to be a large population for a prolonged period of time. Definitely not Chucochatti. Related, sure, but not the main village that we're looking for. So, sort of the primary focus of our investigation was where Chucochatti's normally highlighted, and that is based on the 1840s, the 1847 General Land Ordinance maps. So this is the first survey for Florida. And basically what we see on that is there's a square on the south end of present-day Brooksville that is labeled as Chucochatti Town. And it has a series of little like black dots, like little houses in the middle of it. And so this is basically where, if you go down there nowadays, this is Highway 50, goes right through it where you, just west of where you branch off to go into downtown. There's a historic marker that Historic Hernando Preservation Society's put up that's the general vicinity marker for Chucochatti. And then this has received a lot of speculation. A friend of mine, Jesse Marshall, and Butch Nipper did a thing where basically they plotted where this would be on modern maps, on modern aerial imagery. And basically that's why, it's placed right there. And so it's been given a site designation officially in the Florida Master Site File that is listed as Chucochatti, but it had never actually been tested. So that was one of the things that we wanted to do. So we got access from the Department of Transportation to look on the south side, and then the city of Brooksville owns a portion of the property as well. And so we went through there and we did metal detecting and judgmental shovel testing. Shovel testing just being little 50 centimeter holes into the ground down to a meter, but if you're looking for something this old, you don't have to go that deep. And we didn't find anything close to what we would expect. Now, what the square could be was one of three things. The square with all the dots in it might be the village of Chucochatti, all of its buildings, all its structures, the entire essence of the town in one small locale. In that case, you would expect to find evidence of lots of structures and then a ton of artifacts that are probably spread in quite a distance from the square itself. Alternatively, this could actually be the town center, essentially the square ground, as are often attributed to creek towns, and that this represents essentially the town center, and then the other structures, the ranching structures, a lot of the residences might have been scattered more farther abroad, sort of like the way we have towns nowadays. And so, but we had to still expect some architectural features and then, pretty substantial archaeological signature as far as artifacts go. And then the third suggestion is that it could be just a vicinity marker. Surveyors didn't actually know where the town was. They just knew that there was a Seminole village somewhere in the vicinity, so they put that square there somewhere on the Chucochatti Prairie to show the Seminole village was in this area. So when we went down there, basically this is what it looked like. Mostly like that. There are a few slightly higher areas, and by slightly higher, I mean a foot above, and enough to where you had live oaks that could grow. So we would do these little shovel tests in some of the better areas, and we found prehistoric sites. Metal detecting was overall pretty miserable in there. It was basically speedily walking away from mosquitoes. And we found, in the end, one musket ball farther, well farther to the south. We found a few horseshoes, something smaller, looks maybe like a donkey shoe. But one problem is this end of Brooksville has been repeated, this area has been used for agriculture, and there are a fairly high density of dairies, it turns out, on the south and east side of Brooksville. So it's sort of, okay, these could be associated with the town, but they could also be associated with settlers in the area. They could also be associated with the agriculture, and it makes more sense that horseshoes would be attributed towards the later. And identifying an aging horseshoes, a little complicated, especially when they're just rusty masses. But basically, we found nothing of the high density of artifacts that you'd anticipate. We would accidentally stumble on something. Instead, we found an area that had been highly manipulated, lots of ditches, lots of berms. Every can and bottle that the people have ever used in Brooksville has now made its way down there. It's essentially the drainage. I'm not going to say that Brooksville is a drinking problem, but the bottles speak for themselves. And we found evidence of like the last tree clearing that's gone through the area. There were chains, cutting material, there were burn spots. or cutting materials like saws and such, but nothing that would suggest the Seminole village. So a tad disappointing, but a tad, bit of a relief at the same time too, because it was nice to know that there's not a major highway running through the Seminole village. So that kind of continued on. So we looked at some various properties on the south side. Just to summarize, we find a musket ball here and a musket ball there. But we found more prehistoric sites, some stone tools, some prehistoric pottery, again, the occasional horseshoe. But again, nothing in any sort of quantity that you would say this is definitely a large-scale domestic site. So what we'll get into a little bit more in a second is when we look at musket balls. I sort of speak like I'm a witness at a trial sometimes, where I say things are consistent with, there's a lot of overlap, and so you kind of have to go with sort of an order of operations for this. And that a musket ball for the U.S. military during this time, they're using their standard weapons an 1816 Springfield, various variants of it, but it's a 69 caliber smoothbore flintlock weapon, and the diameter of the musket balls that you'd use for that are about 0.64 or 0.65 is typically what we find around forts and battlefields. Smaller because the gun slowly fouls up over time, so that way you can easily fire several rounds before you have to clean it. And then after that, we start kind of going into more of the overlap. So the Seminoles would have had a broad range of weapons. This is an argument that me and a few other people make, that they would have used everything from older British and Spanish weapons, military weapons, up to like Brown Besses, which would be a 75 caliber. They would have had a certain amount of Springfields. The first day of the first official battle of the Seminole War is where an entire column, so over 100 soldiers, are killed in one spot. That's 100 muskets that instantly go into Seminole hands on the first day. So we know the Seminoles have some of these. And then in addition to that, they're going to have smaller caliber weapons. They're going to have what we call trade guns. Those come in every variety under the sun. They're going to have hunting rifles, which tend to be smaller caliber weapons and leave certain patterns when they're fired out of them. They're going to have fowling guns, which are like you would have a shotgun nowadays with bird shot or buckshot, where you're firing some small beads or small pellets, essentially, little very small balls. So you're going to have this whole range. Now the difference is the military guns, you would expect that their musket balls they're mass produced. So they're not going to have mold seams or sprue scars or anything like that. They're not hand making them in the field. They're being transported already in cartridges. And some of those also include little bits of buckshot. They've got buck and ball loads, where there's multiple pieces of buckshot for every musket ball that's in there. Whereas the Seminoles would have been using more of handmade things. So it would have been, you do see mold seams, sprue scars where they're having to make them, sometimes on the fly. And then there's a lot of overlap with civilian weapons. So civilians, you're going to be making your own musket balls. You could be buying them as well. And you're going to have the same range of hunting weapons, and you want generally mid to small calibers for this. You shoot, like a pheasant with a .65 ball, you're just going to blow it up, and you're not going to have a whole lot to eat. So you want to use your smaller caliber weapons. But anyways, so this is sort of the overlap that we use. So we wouldn't expect them to be using the larger bullets. But, and again, we sort of have to have this constant consideration. Bullets start changing in the 1860s, and then eventually get into cartridge weapons, but they're always going to be holdouts. And there are people who do muzzle loading hunting today. So occasionally you'll find modern musket balls out there as well. So just moving on eastwards, once again, we would continue to find the occasional musket ball here and there. This one's got a little bit of pig chewing on it. And then we find these little melted lead blobs. So that's usually an indication that they're making a musket ball on the spot. But we would find these just completely isolated. And then we kept moving onwards. And so one of the places that we wanted to look at was an area that met the description from the reports and a journal about where Camp Broadnax was. So, reminded that it was just a short-lived encampment there. and then there's be a small engagement kind of associated with it. Well, I went out there with a group of volunteer metal detectorists, and almost right off the bat, they started finding stuff in the vicinity. I think we started off with this frizzen right here. That's part of basically a firing mechanism where the flint hits it, that sparks into the pan and detonates it. And that's after we cleaned it up. And then we started finding a lot of these buttons right here. Now, this is a fancy LA. You've got an LA down here, cannon right here. And then these are eagles with a shield in the middle that have A. So all these are artillery buttons. The LA means light artillery. Cannonball is an earlier one. And then these are more the style used during the Second Seminole War. The rest of these are sort of War of 1812 to post-War of 1812. Just like the modern military, they surplus a lot of materials. Sometimes they give people the newest stuff, sometimes they don't. Older coats might have been put in storage, older buttons might have been put in storage. Sometimes they're doled out to volunteer units, militia units. It's not surprising to see a mix of much older accoutrements on something like this. But it was interesting, one of the notable things is William Lindsay was a commander in the artillery regiment. Now, artillery gets used in a different way during the war. They basically end up using it as infantry for the most part, but it's possible. And then he did a lot of moving around in the greater southeast, going from armory to armory and storage facility to storage facility, basically collecting everything he could for volunteers for when he would eventually equip his troops. So we found this, and in addition to this, I believe we found 15 lead projectiles. Musket balls or lead shot of various sizes. But what we didn't find is ones that were military size. We didn't find the .64s, the .65s. Instead, we found a lot of smaller caliber or mid-caliber stuff. And we found several impacted musket balls. So sort of the way I interpreted this is that sort of where the edge of our property was that we had access to is a wood line. And that would be sort of down slope of the fort. Or the encampment. And so what we might have been seeing is essentially the Seminole musket balls from the skirmish essentially coming out of the tree line. And that it's possible that there would be more impacted musket balls from the U.S. military down in the direction from where that was coming. Fortunately, that area is kind of mined out. There are some problems with it. But nonetheless, I would have liked to have seen some drop shot where cartridge gets dropped, the paper eventually rolls away, and you get an unimpacted musket ball, U.S. military musket ball, deposited where the encampment was. But nonetheless, these buttons here, that's still the largest assemblage of buttons in this vicinity, and kind of enough to suggest that we've got at least some sort of military component there, and everything seems to be consistent with Camp Broadnax. And then we got these 3 gun parts. That's probably a frizzen for a pistol, it's pretty small. And then these 2 are problematic. This one here has cutting on it where the mounting tenons on this trigger guard have been modified, and then they're both brass. All the U.S. military muskets at this time use iron arms furniture. One reason why we might not be finding it is that could be rusting away. You might also find just random pieces of rusted metal that you can't identify that can sometimes be gun parts. So what tends to survive is the brass stuff that doesn't erode. But the problem is again, you got modifications. This is a little unusual for an American musket. And then this is consistent with an India pattern British Brown Bess, the most common musket in the world at this time. It's what the British equipped half the world with. It was essentially the AK-47 of its time. And we know that the Seminoles were purchased and or were given large quantities of these during the Creek War and during the First Seminole War. So some of these likely persisted into this time. So this suggests a Seminole component. So the question was, were these either guns that had basically been lost during the skirmish, or was this additional evidence of Seminole use of the area before or after, basically unrelated to the encampment? Well, we kept proceeding east along the property, and we kept finding, and we'd find little things here and there, they're prehistoric sites, lots of historic material, post-dating the war. In the middle of the property, there was a random pistol barrel. That's a really weird size. It's a really large caliber for the length of the barrel. It's like a foot-long barrel. So I'm still trying to figure out what that one is. But we kept going, and about, I think it was 1,000 meters or 1,500 meters, but still within eyeshot of Camp Broadnax, we suddenly find all these other artifacts. So we find, I think it was another 16 projectiles, and then we find gun parts to at least 5 different guns. One of the fun ones is we found all 5 of these pieces in a, 20-foot area, where it appears that each piece was manually hinge fractured. And then they have these kind of unique square holes. When you look at the back, it almost looks like they're square holes forced around original round holes. We thought maybe that was a little bit of modification going on. But in a 1963 thesis on Spalding's Lower Store, Spalding's Lower Store being one of the main trade stores that the Seminoles would have had during the later periods, basically had this butt plate that has the exact same design as this. And so we know that this was a Type C trade gun that was for sale at the store, the type of weapons that would have been available to the Seminole for purchase. And it's a spot-on match, and it even has some of the same weird little square holes, so maybe that was actually part of the manufacturer on it. This one here is a classic, this is a portion of what we call a serpent side plate. So basically this would have come up and then you would have had the head of a snake or basically like a sea serpent. And again, this is a common feature on what we call Northwest trade guns. Northwest trade gun being a very, very common weapon that came in every variety, all the way from northern Canada to down here. And it was very popular with Indians in general. Here we've got something else that looks like a broken part of sort of a brown Bess side plate with these weird little grooves kind of taken out of it. This one's a little bit flatter, less robust than the other one, suggesting that maybe it was like a militia model or a marine model used by the British when they start kind of getting cheaper. Alternatively, this could have been just an imitation, because a lot of weapons around the world start using very similar styles, including the United States, but ours are iron. We got ramrod pipes. We have other trigger guards, another side plate. But like I said, at least 5 different weapons, and everything that we're finding is brass. Nothing here appears to be U.S. military. And then there's additional modification on a lot of things. These weird little grooves, things are filed in certain areas. So they're definitely doing stuff with this. And whether they're turning this into jewelry or repurposing it for another reason, I don't know. But another possibility is that essentially they're modifying and putting guns back together to keep these really old guns in functioning shape. And then as far as the musket balls went, they were all tended to be small and mid-caliber things, except we did have 1.66 musket ball. So maybe that was, it would technically fit in the military components, so that's a possibility. And then as we kept going, the site kept getting more and more interesting. So we found several of these barrel hoops. I think these are, the big ones are 10 inches and the smaller ones are 6.75. They found the exact same ones at Spalding's Lower Store. And we found half dozen of these still whole, and then just countless fragments, at a point where we basically had to stop looking at the fragments because, they were just, it was just too numerous after a point. But it definitely showed they were storing a lot of something there. Now at Spalding's Lower Store, I think they speculated that it was, they were barrels for nails, because they found a lot of square nails in the vicinity of them. And although they had also speculated that based on some of the accounts by like Bartram and all that they are actually used for rum. And, kind of speculated whether or not they were used for gunpowder, but it kind of turns out the barrels of this size were just common pony keg size barrels. So it could have been a lot of things without maybe doing chemical testing. Probably wouldn't be able to tell you. But we found this interesting little hand ball mold, what we'd call a bag mold nowadays. And my colleague estimated the diameter inside, and it would make about a 0.42 inch ball. Within about 10 feet of that, we found this interesting little pyramidal shaped lead ingot with these little notches in it. So basically, I calculated roughly the volume of each of these notches, and if you were to divide that evenly along the bar, and it would produce about 12.45 inch balls, which would be pretty consistent with that thing. And then we found more interesting stuff. So this site I would later call the brass workshop, partially because of all the modifications of the brass weaponry, but largely because of these things here. In total, we had 11 whole pieces, and then these two other little fragments that are enough there to claim. So we ended up with 13 of these rolled brass arrowheads. Now, they're called Kaskaskia points. And they first appear in Illinois along the Kaskaskia River when the French start trading kettles with the local tribes. And basically, as soon as goods are given to Native people, we see their own unique modifications on these items. And so the case was here. We ended up finding tons and tons of scrap brass. And then we found multiple of these bale ears, suggesting that they were going to kettles, at least two different types of those. But basically what it looks like is that they were using this area as sort of a workshop to make these rolled brass arrowheads. Now, these aren't terribly common. They appear in the 1600s, but you don't really see them that much in creek sites. And that's because by the time, there's a lot of interaction and trade with the creek, they've got flintlock weapons, and people are more than happy to trade flintlock weapons to the natives. And then that's, as I mentioned, that deerskin economy that kind of comes in. And so they kind of abandon the bow and arrow for a large part. It becomes sort of a training weapon for children, but for the most part, hunting goes away with this. And so you don't really see them there, and then they re-pop up in Florida during the Second Seminole War. And then they persist into Oklahoma into the 1920s. So I kind of speculate that they're, and then during the war, you'll occasionally hear something that'll sort of refer to a bow and arrow being used in battle, but not much. And so, my speculation on this is that they're largely basically being used to save on ammunition, and then they're also being used for hunting to not give away their position. So as I mentioned, that you still have Seminoles occupying areas where soldiers are still in the vicinity. And Seminoles always know where the soldiers are at, soldiers don't know where the Seminoles are at. And so this is one way that you could still go out and hunt without giving away your position. And then, like I said, as the war goes on, they're running out of lead, they're running out of gunpowder because they're not renewing their supply. The American military makes it sound like they're still resupplying by the Spanish, but they're really not. And, traders will certainly, in any war, will certainly trade with anyone who is working money, but they don't really have access to traders as the war goes on either. So essentially what they're only getting is what they can either get from homesteads or what they can win off of battles. So that's my speculation on that. And for the most part, they're about 3 inches in length, 2 to 3 inches, except for this weird one here that's like 4 or 5 inches. I don't know if it's supposed to be a lance or someone showing off or hypertrophic. Probably wouldn't make a great arrowhead. But apparently these large ones also occur. The other largest collection I've seen is in South Florida near Miami, where there were 11 sites, and they also describe that in private collections. People have found ones even larger than that. Not sure what that would be used for. But we didn't just find munitions material, but that was definitely the bulk of the material. I think we found 3 of the brushed ceramics like that. You can see the design a little bit better right here. Now granted, to be fair, we mostly did metal detecting. Metal detecting is not a great way to find ceramics. But we did do some selective judgmental shovel testing across the area, mostly to see how disturbed the landscape was. To see if there were any sort of remnant features in the ground, anything that would be associated with pits or domestic life structures. And there really wasn't. The problem that we had was that, the area has been constantly used either for residential purposes or agricultural purposes ever since the war. Essentially, land patents were put in within 5 years of the conclusion of the war, and this place has been occupied ever since. You take disking through the area, use a 24-inch blade, so you've got about 10 to 12 inches of ground disturbance. And This is something that only happened in the early 1800s, not a lot of soil accumulation, so it basically ruined any sort of subsurface features that we would have. Similarly, at Camp Broadnax, very ephemeral archaeological signature. The plowing, a house had been built on top of the hill, either where the fortifications would have been or right next to them, and that is almost certainly erased the archaeological signature. But we still found some non-metal items. So it was enough to say that this is definitely Seminole. Definitely not anyone else doing this, but it's not enough to really say that this is any sort of substantial domestic population. This is not the village of Chucochatti. It appears to be some sort of arms depot or something like that. But we did find some other interesting things. This is a croto bell, basically a sleigh bell, very popular with, I imagine, Native Americans all across eastern North America, but definitely the southeastern. These are occasionally found as prestige goods amongst Creek burials. And then the cool thing about these is they're very specific based on the designs, how these are all oriented, that's where it was modified, but these designs and then different initials that are written on here. So this particular bell with the letters J and W, we were able to find that it was produced sometime between 1760 and 1777. So that would be consistent with early Chucochatti, but again, this might have been a prized item that was essentially handed down from person to person. We got a lot of the dark green bottle glass, which is very common at this period, just very, very common on the forts and battlefields. Square nails, painted creamware. And then this silver buckle. This one we were able to find a similar example also at that Spalding's Lower store, and this one has the letters PB over AB, and this one, if I recall, was 1791 to 1799 was when this particular buckle's manufactured, when those initials were used for this manufacturing company. So definitely Seminole component, but not large domestic. So, to sort of sum up what we found is we found Seminole components, Hope Homestead was already known before we got there, but we have Seminole components both west and east of the survey plot, but really nothing in the center. Not, the survey plot's definitely not the village of Chucochatti. So it appears to be, it was that sort of vicinity representative marker. But on the other hand, we've shown that Seminole do have a presence in this area. Chucochatti, the region, Chucochatti, the town, definitely in the area. Whether or not an archaeological record of that town still exists still remains to be seen. And one of the other things is, we were able to accomplish our goal of at least finding one aspect of the military campaign. The other one would be Camp Chisholm, which we have kind of an idea of what we'd like to do for a proposal, but that one's sort of, you've got 1,000 little tiny buildings around the lake, where everyone's property basically wouldn't be enough to really survey. We've got a couple areas around the vicinity that we think we might be able to try to locate that fort. But the thing is, the Seminole Wars are highly underrepresented in Hernando County. In fact, history and archaeology is largely underrepresented in Hernando County. Unfortunately, mining has done a lot of damage up there. So the thing is, none of the other forts are really actively represented. None of the engagements, it's very barely represented in museums or anything like that. So at least acknowledging one encampment, one aspect of the campaign is a massive improvement for that area. Here we've at least got Fort Cooper. They've got nothing. And so sort of moving forward, we didn't encounter everything. I mean, there's a lot of ground that we have to cover. I forget how many acres. It was I think it was over 1,000 acres that we covered. And that last area took 7 months or something like that, I think, of metal detecting. It was just going back and back. And honestly, we could still, eventually we just had to kind of cut it off. We had enough information, but, it's just one of those that as much as we wanted to metal detect out there, we were still going to be able to find stuff. But, we sort of got our purposes. We found the gist of what was there. And the thing that was kind of neat about the brass workshop is it's odd to describe because there's not really a parallel for this. This is a new type of site. So that's why I'm like, a munitions depot for a Native American group, at least for this time period, is kind of unheard of. And the problem is, the Seminole villages haven't really, one's never really been excavated well, or at least where the results turned out well. So there's really not a great record for Seminole sites in general anyways, or for this period of Seminole sites, or early Seminole sites. But to find something like this was just completely different. So how we even classify it, and sort of having to, still think about how I describe this, how I talk to people about this. But, in the future, there's still some areas that we can cover. There were landowners I couldn't get a hold of. One of the biggest property along the Chattahoochee Prairie ended up going up for sale just as soon as we started the project. And people tend to get spooked by archaeologists when they're trying to sell property because they think it'll complicate matters, make it more expensive, make it cheaper, or they'll, be afraid that some other entity will kind of come in and commandeer the place. It doesn't happen like that, but nonetheless, that's sort of obstacles that we kind of come into. So there's still several areas that we would like to look at, several more targeted surveys that we could do in the future. In addition to that, some of the things that we could do is highlight other sites. So I'm currently in the process of having a marker put up that'll represent the vicinity of Camp Broadnax and the Brass Workshop and the Tochudka Road. And then hopefully within the next 2 years, we'll put one up in the vicinity of Fort Cross. We do have a good idea where Fort Cross was. I would like to do some archaeological verification for that, but I've got enough reliable sources that we know where it's at. It's already been plotted for the Florida Master Site File, but we can put up more interpretation. We can let more people know essentially the history of this area, that life doesn't just begin at 1842 in Hernando County. And then another thing that we can do is actually survey some of the roads, some of the skirmishes, and those will actually lead us to more Seminole villages. So we know where the Tochudka Road terminus is. So, and I know roughly where it starts. So if we can figure out the route in better detail, we can better kind of map out these campaigns and get a better idea of sort of Seminole relationships. Like, there are multiple towns along this road, and in various maps you'll see different towns, different names used. And so understanding whether or not those towns all existed at the same time, or these are towns that come and go over time, would do wonders for understanding how the Seminole occupied this area. And then of course there's always more archival material. You always find random stuff, in archives. Like I remember there was some stuff, I think for Miccosukee, for the Battle of Miccosukee, that was, or maybe it was the fort in Miccosukee, that was found in Ethan Allen's collection somewhere in New York. So the thing is, archival stuff is going to always continue to be found in one way or another. So, there's still some ways we can go from here. A little disappointing that we didn't find the village itself, but we found some other interesting stuff, and I think we made some headway into history of Hernando County. So that's what I have for you now. Thank you very much. Like I said, thank you guys for coming out. Thank you for your interest. In particular, the people I want to thank is Historic Hernando Preservation Society, people who gave us connections, gave us a lot of information. The landowners were very, very valuable. We had some really great landowners, especially the one with the Brass Workshop. He got out there and metal detected with us. And then, of course, I had some great metal detectorists who worked with me. Went through a lot of hot days, but I think it was pretty rewarding even for them, because there aren't a lot of opportunities to see stuff like that. And then my mandatory thing that says that if I said anything weird, that the National Park Service doesn't have to agree with me. All right, I'll be happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. I can't see the YouTube questions, so if anyone wants to post comments on the YouTube video, either me or maybe my friend Chris Kimball might actually reply. So I'll be happy to answer any. Unfortunately, he was supposed to be watching the thing tonight, but he had other plans, so he'll have to watch it at another time. So if you have any easy archaeological questions, I'll be happy to answer them. If you have difficult questions, please address them to my friend Jesse over there. He'll be happy to answer them. But, all right, any questions? Yes? You mean for the brass workshop part? It almost seemed like there sort of were, no, it definitely wasn't a singular dump per se, and there almost seemed to be some sort of activity areas, like I think a lot of the gun parts were sort of found on this one crest of the hill, basically, so it almost looked like there was sort of a modification area for guns in one spot. Like I said, a lot of the melted lead and then the lead ingot and the bullet mold all seem to be a little bit closer to the sort of downslope of that in some sort of one coagulated or concentrated area. There were other things like knives and axe heads that were also found. Those sort of seemed to be in the area. It definitely seemed that there was an intentional layout, but it was just sort of abandoned there. So it doesn't seem like it was a dump. You know, if it was concealed at all, I'm not sure, but it looks like that maybe it was one of these skirmishes or something that basically chased out the population. They just had to sort of leave it there. But it looks like sort of everything kind of sort of was left in place. But there weren't any like pits or any trash piles or anything. And then there was, again, there was a lot of other material that I didn't really talk about in here that, like Homestead, you have intermingled material because there appeared to be that they were working on cars in the early 1900s in one part of the farm. You know, we found like a brass tire gauge, and there was definitely like later brass in the area, and some of that looked like it was kind of in dumps. I don't know, this seemed to have some sort of layout, and it wasn't any sort of like coagulated pit either, or concentrated pit either by the Seminole themselves or by any sort of subsequent residents.
Was there any population-like settlement in this area around that time? Had people started moving in here at all?
White settlers, well, the thing is, this is still technically the reservation, so they're banned from living in this area. You have around Tampa near the forts, you kind of get small populations that prop up, but those are technically all off reservation, like in Miccosukee or Tampa around Fort Brooke. No, so technically it was illegal for people to settle in this area. And then the thing is, as the war was going on, it would have been very unsafe for them to live in the area. But as soon as the war ends, immediately patents and land grants start popping up all over the place.
When you were first showing some of the maps where the different tribes were located, different groups of people, I thought I heard you talking about they had part of the slaves population, that they were dealing in slavery, or were they enslaved? I'm not sure that I understood what you were referring to.
Well, you do have the black Seminoles, so you have a fugitive slave population, right? So these are runaway slaves, coming from other states, and depending on who you ask about the Seminole Wars, that's considered a motivating factor in it. And that was one of the arrangements, was that in each of the treaties, they tried to get Seminoles to hand over black, fugitive slaves or black Seminoles. I sort of use a distinguishing term that, like, Maroons tend to be African Americans or former enslaves who basically don't have any association with Seminoles. So that's places like Angola, which is south of Tampa, which is one of the sort of the focus of the Coweta raid. And then you've got black Seminoles are the African Americans who are associated with the Seminoles. Now, they were still slaves of the Seminole people. It was a different style of slavery, but they were still owned. When ultimately most of the black Seminoles got to be transported to Oklahoma with the Seminoles, or still remain down here, and you end up with various populations of black Seminoles in the Bahamas, in Mexico, in Texas, where they would still kind of avoid their own areas, because their fate was actually worse than any sort of captured Native Americans. But they would have had their own towns, and it sort of would have been more of a tribute system. And that's why, one of the things why I mentioned earlier agriculture, one speculation on the way Seminoles might have viewed agriculture is that some of them sort of describe it as work that's beneath them, that they didn't mind ranching, but they preferred hunting. They didn't really like farming. And so sort of the idea was, well, let's make the black Seminoles do that. And so there appears to be sort of a tribute system where they would take a little bit of tax off of them, and then they basically got to live as their own town. And then in some places like Chucochatti, they would have lived alongside of them. But you do have separate towns like Paliklakaha or Abrahamstown. So there was definitely black slavery, but it was different, not necessarily as violent as sort of American slavery. But and then there is also amongst native groups, but it tends to be earlier, there is slavery amongst natives, where they will enslave other peoples. The groups that involved, that caused that whole thing in the early 1700s, a lot of them were very violent and sort of would enslave people, but that was the Yamasees when they eventually sort of get depleted themselves. So you do have some sort of that, but as that goes on, that kind of goes away.
We're talking about the age of association of a lot of these things that you found together with the different layers of the dirt, I guess. Back on the not a better word. But I was curious, I'm sorry if I missed this, but did you guys do any carbon dating with a lot of these things?
The problem is carbon dating is not really functional for this time period. Like, carbon dating is more useful for things that are like 1,000 years or older. Yeah, because your margin of error ends up being like, I mean, at best, a margin of error of like 20 years. And then more likely, like when I get them for my prehistoric coastal sites, I get 50-year, 100-year intervals. So that's literally the entire Seminole period, or historic Seminole period. So yeah, unfortunately that doesn't really work well. So it's more of contextual dating of things like that buckle, like getting an 8 or 9 year period on something is fantastic. That's about as good of a range as you're ever going to get. And then, it's a possibility I can do that with some of the gun parts, but, just takes a lot more refinement.
Now, have you gone to, all I can say is going out Highway 44 towards the interstate, and that area back up in there, and I know that when they were coming in for the war, Indians would leave and go down the Wicklow and hide out. I lived in an area called Arrowhead for a while, so I could be on the water, find pottery, arrowheads, all kinds of stuff. And they would even go into different places, up into the woods. That they would hide and then, like you say, go back out. But have you studied like those areas up in there?
No, and there's never really been a widespread survey. So in the 1980s, Brent Wiseman did some stuff for the Withlacoochee River, Cove of the Withlacoochee, and sort of went in the Panosofkee, Salapopka area, and speculated that's where he found Powellstown, which was a short-term encampment that Osceola may have stayed in. But essentially that entire area would have been littered. And so as the war goes on, the more and more remote areas, the more difficult areas would have been populated by Seminoles. Now, what you're describing, finding arrowheads and spear points, that would all be prehistoric. Like I said, by this point, they're not really using arrowheads at all. Occasionally, you might find a little piece of sharpened glass, but it's basically these rolled brass arrowheads are kind of the reinvention of that. But on the other hand, there is a very common pattern of Seminoles reoccupying areas that prehistoric people had been, largely for the same purposes, because you would have had access to fresh water, usually dry ground that's not susceptible to flooding immediately. But no, there hasn't really been widespread survey of that. It is one proposal that a friend of mine wants us to put in this September, which would basically be a widespread survey along the Cove of the Withlacoochee to sort of ascertain that. Because, like I said, nobody's touched it in 30, 40 years. So we sort of want to do some reevaluations, land ownership's changed and all that. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly a Seminole presence in there. It's just hasn't been located.
So do you take all of your findings and reduce them to different articles? Where do you deposit all of this for people to research later?
Well, so for most of this, what happens is I put these in technical reports. So I have to provide a technical report to the granting agency. The problem is sometimes I can make those available, sometimes I can't, because this has a lot of private property information. So some people, just don't want that information made available. So sometimes I can do redacted versions. For Historic Hernando, since this is a historical society that really wanted this done, it doesn't do them a lot of good if I can't make a publication that's not available to everyone in their group. So right now, so I'm working on making one that I can do widespread handouts. I don't tend to write a lot of journal articles, and those usually are pretty hard for the public to get a hold of anyways, just because it's time consuming. That's more of a people who make salary. I basically have to do that for free, sort of, whereas I don't get any funding to write articles, sort of. So I write these big technical reports, and then sometimes they're accessible, sometimes they're not. Now, what we have is that we have what's called the Seminole Wars Foundation. And we basically have taken every piece of literature that we can find and have amassed it in what our headquarters is in Bushnell. And basically we're now that we're getting out of COVID, or at least more acceptable levels of COVID, we're at the point where basically people can come and research and have access to all these documents. But for the most part, dissemination of information is through things like this. Or, if people come and talk to us at different events, like reenactments and such.
So my real question is, how would somebody 15, 20 years from now take and build on all of the good work that you've done?
Oh, well, the thing is, it's other professionals should be able to get access to this. I put this on file with the Florida Master Site file. Yeah, it's like I said, so it's not necessarily going to be in public libraries, but yeah, there are various places where I leave records. And then I tend to, for example, the landowner where Broadnax or the former landowner where Broadnax and the Brass Workshop were found, he gets a copy of that. With stipulation, understanding, don't necessarily spread this around for a certain period of time, but I usually try to make sure that at least so many copies are around. So Historic Hernando will have a full copy that they can then disseminate in the future. It's almost sort of like having a time period. But yeah, I try to make sure that there are enough copies floating around, and that I also try to make sure that key researchers get copies of these as well. Again, information's useless if nobody gets to see it.
Have you ever used ground penetrating radar as a way to triage in a big field, clues to where to set up your grids?
Once in a while, more of that on sort of the forts. So definitely areas where I would know that there are subsurface features. Plowed fields like this, you're really gambling. And then, of course, the problem is with GPR, you just get an anomaly. It doesn't really tell you what it is. If you're running GPR over a cemetery and you see, 7-foot-long holes or 8-foot-long holes, you can kind of guess what those anomalies are. But that's the problem is it ends up being a lot of just digging up random blobs. The problem is I don't currently have one at my institute, and I don't have any of the software to run it, so I would have to hire somebody to do it. So for some projects we hire, but for these massive fields, that would have taken a long time and would have cost a sizable portion of the grant.
See, I don't know what the burial practices were in the Seminoles, if they buried underground, and to see if that would be a way to help you identify where their cemetery was going to be, and then their population areas.
Yeah, it's a possibility, and then it's usually I'm trying to avoid finding human remains. The Seminoles have some interesting practices. They have sort of an aversion of bodies after death. I don't know what they're doing necessarily during the war, but nowadays, they basically, if somebody dies, they stay away from them. And in fact, they'll stay away from all their possessions. So if someone dies, especially under bad circumstances, they'll take all their possessions out of their house and just drag it out into the woods and leave it. They are very, and typically when I find human remains on even like prehistoric sites, since the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee tribe are the only recognized tribes in Florida, they basically get to speak for the remains for previous groups, whether or not they're directly related or not. And almost always it's kind of leave them in place. I mean, that would be one possibility, but it's usually the presence of artifacts that sort of give away the signature before you'd find evidence of human remains. It'd just be a smaller area. But like I said, the main thing is it's ground penetrating radar is just kind of prohibitive over large spaces. Or at least cost prohibitive for me. If I had one on hand, it'd probably be a lot cheaper. But anything else? All right, thank you very much.